Chapter 6 is about romance at work. It follows on the previous chapter, which looked at work relationships, focusing a lot more on peer relationships and blended relationships. But romance at work is an extremely important topic. What do we mean by romance at work? Well, we mean those cases where you form a close bond with somebody at work. Um, Uncommonly close. It could be a bond that involves intimacy, both emotional and sometimes physical intimacy. When people have these romantic bonds, unlike sort of regular coworker relationships, they may share inside information, feel extreme sense of affection and loyalty. So the question of this chapter you know, is that a good thing? And if so, how do we pursue these relationships in ways that reduce the risk and make them safe for us, our partners, and our coworkers and our organizations? I think a message that comes through in the chapter is that these relationships are common and pretty normal, but they need to be handled with care because they can go bad in a hurry and sometimes lead to negative consequences. But I should reveal that more than 40 years ago, I met my own spouse at work, and it worked out just fine. Why are these relationships important? Well, first, they're really common. One of the studies reported in the chapter suggests that 60% of coworkers or workers report that they've had a romantic bond with someone at work, or at least been affected by one of those bonds that developed amongst their coworkers. These relationships can be incredibly rewarding. After all, we get to know people very well at work. We are interdependent with them. We share a lot of values and commitments through our work. But they can also be risky. They can have unintended consequences. And even in the media, we sometimes see high profile cases of relationships gone bad. And what can happen sometimes is what starts out as a consensual relationship and a rewarding relationship ends, is terminated by one of the partners. And then that leads to a period of discomfort for the partners and the people around them. Sometimes extreme reactions can be perceptions of sexual harassment, right? Um, Organizations know these are important because they sometimes lead to lawsuits. And so organizations have to be very mindful about their policies about dating at work and having intimate relationships with coworkers to protect themselves and also to kind of create an environment that feels safe for everyone. So let's look a bit about what the research tells us on these relationships. Well, one of the things that we know is, as I said, they are very common. And sometimes these relationships lead to long-term connections, even marriage. So it's not uncommon. But we also see that these relationships sometimes generate gossip at work, and they can create disharmony sometimes because people perceive that the partners are favoring each other, um, that someone is getting a promotion, for instance, because they're in a relationship, not because their work is excellent. So these relationships can make work more harmonious because the people in the relationships are happy and their coworkers are happy for them, but they can also lead to disharmony. As the research sort of suggests both things. We know from research on coworker perceptions that people notice when these relationships are developing and they form opinions about them. And so gossip is sometimes a downside of these relationships as people speculate about what's happening and sometimes form negative perceptions because they believe that someone is getting special treatment who doesn't deserve it, right? So as we mentioned, favoritism. So these relationships can sometimes um, be disruptive. The relationships seem to be most problematic when power differences are involved, when one partner has power, more power than the other, or is perceived as using their power to advantage someone else in the relationship. So we have to be super important about that and think about those potential perceptions of coworkers. Now, we know, for instance, that female members of these partnerships are often perceived more negatively than male members, at least in some organizations that have been studied. And that may reflect some cultural biases that we need to be aware of when we think about forming these relationships and how we're responding to them. The chapter provides a number of case studies, including one that focuses on an organization called Half Price Books. And in that organization, at least at the time that we read about it and learned about it, romantic relationships were encouraged. They were considered to be normal, and any number of people in the organization were married, for instance. The organization recognized that these relationships have to be handled carefully. There has to be clear policies about them, but they also found that they really contributed to people's satisfaction at work and an environment that felt welcoming, warm, and even family-like. Later in the chapter, we report some other case studies where relationships dissolved and created some negative consequences for the people involved and for the organization. We talk about the research on the dissolution or the ending of these relationships. And we may all know from films like Fatal Attraction, if you haven't seen that film, it's about an unhealthy attraction between people who work together. We have heard about claims of harassment. Many of them have been, clearly supported by evidence. Harassment that developed after a relationship ended and one partner persisted in their trying to keep the relationship going when the other didn't, and that led to an unsafe work environment, a risky environment. Sometimes people just report discomfort having to continue to work in the same work group as a former romantic partner. Sometimes they end up transferring, leaving the organization, asking for help from HR to sort of manage these situations. So when relationships end, negative consequences can happen. So what to do about that? As we think about this research and the case studies that are introduced in the chapter, we see that smart organizations are usually those who don't ignore these relationships, but are very clear about the policies and expectations for people who are forming romantic bonds. The chapter even discusses this idea of love contracts. These are written agreements between the partners that spell out the kinds of behavior that will be acceptable, what will happen when the relationship ends, and also calls attention to things like perceptions of favoritism and encourage people to be careful about them. They may also protect the organization from lawsuits or legal action. And so organizations are making the rules more clear, being more explicit about their expectations. And I think that's a good thing for partners as well. Let's not just let this relationship sneak up on us. Let's be clear that it's happening and talk about how we want to handle it at work. When we think about the communication options in this section, we think about the options for coworkers. What do they do when they're faced with a romantic relationship developing? Do they communicate support? Do they remain silent? If they have concerns, do they express them? That's something you may need to think about if you're finding that another person's relationship is affecting your ability to do your job. And then for the partners themselves, part of their agreement needs to be, they need to discuss things like how are they going to communicate affection at work, if at all? How will they address each other and behave with each other at work? How will they explain their relationship to others? And do they have a kind of a contractual agreement with the organization? Are they aware of the rules and regulations that the organization has for these kinds of relationships? As we end the chapter, we encourage you to apply the risk and negotiation framework. As we attend to these relationships, one of the things that the chapter encourages us to do is think about our motives. Relationships that are started with the intention of getting close to someone in order to advance at work, for instance, are generally, well, first of all, an unethical abuse of someone else, an unethical abuse of our own power and authority sometimes. And we also know people who have strong positive motives can often find ways to create these bonds that are constructive and supportive. Sense making means talking to people at work, talk to your HR representative, talk to other people at work about workplace romances. What has happened in that organization in the past? What's the history in the organization? What can they tell you about both the advantages and disadvantages of that? Transforming the risk means taking action. Often that means putting rules in place, explaining to others about your relationship and how they might respond to it, rather than allowing gossip to determine that. Finally, the maintenance part of the model really speaks to organizations and creating an environment where people can be very clear about the expectations that the organization has, that there are policies in place, that there might even be some kind of a contract for people to sign and agree to minimize the negative fallout that could come from that relationship. But I will end on a positive note, which is that, again, these relationships are quite common and often they can be very rewarding.